The courtroom was never meant for a child, especially not one wearing second-hand sneakers and carrying a blue binder held together by worn duct tape. But on that gray March morning in downtown Brooklyn, it wasn't the polished shoes of the lawyers or the clicking pens of reporters that drew all eyes. It was the steady voice of an 8-year-old boy who rose from his chair, adjusted his collar with trembling fingers, and said, "Your Honor, I would like to speak on behalf of my grandmother." Judge William Carter paused mid-sentence, the pen in his hand freezing just above the paper. He lifted his eyes slowly above his glasses and peered at the boy who had just broken every unspoken rule of the room. The silence cracked open like a dropped plate. The jury turned. The prosecutor frowned. The gallery stirred. "Young man," Judge Carter said, trying to keep his voice even, "you should be in school." "I know, sir," Marcus replied, his voice small but unwavering. "But my grandmother has heart problems, and I'm afraid if I don't speak, this might break her." There was something in the way he said it. Not just the words, but the weight they carried. Not desperation, not defiance. Something else. Something older than a child should carry. Something worn in like his binder and frayed like the cuffs of his hoodie. The judge hesitated. His gut told him no. Protocol said no. But then his eyes fell on the woman seated beside the public defender's vacant chair. Dorothy Johnson, 72 years old, skin soft as creased paper, sat rigid in a borrowed blazer. Her eyes were damp but defiant. Alone. Her lawyer had withdrawn from the case the day before when he realized Dorothy couldn't pay the remaining fees. The judge remembered the headlines. Misappropriation of nearly $18,000 from the Bedford-Stuyvesant Neighborhood Housing Program. A program Dorothy had founded and run for 15 years without taking a single paycheck. "You may speak for 5 minutes," the judge said finally, "as a witness, not as counsel." "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus nodded, stepping forward slowly. The bailiff moved to stop him, but Judge Carter held up a hand. Marcus placed his binder on the wooden table that dwarfed him and opened it with care. Inside were photocopies, handwritten notes, receipts color-coded with crayons. The prosecutor, David Richardson, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, an amused sneer tugging at his lips. "This is highly irregular," he said. "I agree," Carter replied without looking at him. "And yet, here we are." Marcus took a breath. "I've lived with my grandma since my parents died. I help her with the program stuff on Sundays. We call it Spreadsheet Sundays." A few quiet chuckles slipped from the gallery, but Marcus didn't smile. "She lets me color-code the receipts, blue for expenses, yellow for donations, green for utilities. We do it every week." "What does this have to do with the alleged theft?" Richardson snapped. "Let the boy speak," the judge said, sharper this time. "She didn't take that money," Marcus continued, flipping to the next page. 3 weeks ago, she noticed weird withdrawals. She wrote them here in her notebook." He held up a small red spiral pad, its cover bent and chewed at the edges. "One was for roof repairs, but I went with her to the center the next day. No one ever touched the roof. I took this photo." He pulled out a printed snapshot. It was grainy, probably from an old phone, but it showed the building's roofline pristine and untouched. Another was for new security cameras. We never got cameras. And one was for a lawyer she never hired. She always got help from friends who worked pro bono. Richardson rolled his eyes. "So now we're accepting surveillance analysis from children?" "Do you have evidence those repairs happened?" Marcus asked, looking up. The question was so direct, so surgical that Richardson blinked. This is irrelevant. Do you have proof she signed those transactions? Marcus continued. Because I checked the signatures. He opened another sheet and laid it flat. These are different. Grandma signs her name with loops. These have no loops. See? He pointed. And the pressure is harder. I read about handwriting analysis at the library. The jury shifted again, whispered. Something was shifting. The judge leaned forward. Son, how did you learn all this? Mrs. Patricia from the public library. She used to work at a law firm. She said the world doesn't always care if you're right, only if you can prove it. This is absurd, Richardson snapped. What's next? Letting his teddy bear testify? But no one laughed. The gallery was still. The judge steepled his fingers. Go on, Marcus. The account that made those payments got a call at 2:30 p.m. the day the money disappeared, Marcus said, flipping again. But Grandma was with me in the emergency room. I had an asthma attack. She was with me from 1 to 5. Here's the hospital log. He held it up. The courtroom gasped softly. Richardson's smugness faltered. Judge Carter took the paper from the boy's hand, read it, then looked back up slowly. You're saying your grandmother couldn't have made those transactions? Yes, sir. She wasn't near a computer, and she doesn't use a smartphone. Your Honor, Richardson said, standing. This is a show, a stunt. This child doesn't know what he's doing. Actually, Marcus replied, I do, because I've studied this case every day for 2 months, because I love her, and because people like us don't get second chances if we don't fight the first time. Dorothy was weeping now, quiet tears running down her cheeks. She had said nothing all morning, too tired to speak, too overwhelmed to stand. But now she reached for her grandson's hand and held it with the kind of grip only a grandmother can give. The judge looked over his glasses again. Mr. Richardson, do you have concrete proof that the defendant authorized these payments? We assumed she was the administrator. The responsibility is hers. And yet, you didn't verify her physical presence, or the company's paid, or the signature authenticity. This isn't a real investigation, it's a child's notebook, Richardson shouted. That child's notebook, Carter said softly, just exposed every flaw in your case. Marcus took one more paper from the folder. This is a recording, he said, from the housing office phone line. It's public, and it says calls may be recorded. We found it 2 weeks ago. It's a man talking about getting Dorothy blamed before the city election. I can play it. Carter looked at Richardson, who had gone pale. Don't, Richardson whispered. Don't play it. Why not? Marcus asked. Are you afraid of what it says? The room held its breath. Carter nodded. Play it. Marcus tapped a small speaker, and there, in front of 12 jurors, a judge, and half a dozen reporters, came the voice of the prosecutor speaking to someone named Tony. I need this case wrapped. Doesn't matter if she did it. She's poor, she's black, she runs a housing program. No one will question it. Gasps. Audible, undeniable. Richardson collapsed into his chair. The judge stood. This court is adjourned. All charges against Dorothy Johnson are dropped. An investigation into prosecutorial misconduct is hereby opened. Applause. From the gallery, the jury box, even the bailiff. Dorothy pulled Marcus into her arms, sobbing. You did it, she whispered. You saved me. No, he whispered back. You saved me first." Outside, reporters swarmed. The boy who broke the courtroom, the 8-year-old lawyer, but Marcus didn't speak to them. He took his grandmother's hand and walked her down the courthouse steps, the wind tugging gently at his sleeves. When asked what he wanted to be when he grew up, he simply said, "I want to help people like her, and make sure people like him never get away with it again." It had been 3 days since the courtroom shook under the weight of an 8-year-old's voice. 3 days since Dorothy Johnson walked out of that courthouse free, not because of a plea deal or a sympathetic jury, but because her grandson had made justice undeniable. The story spread faster than either of them could keep up. By the time they got home that evening, there were flowers on the stoop, anonymous notes under the door, and 3 voicemails from local news channels. But none of that mattered to Marcus. What mattered was that Grandma Dorothy was finally sleeping peacefully again. For the first time in months, he didn't hear her cry behind the bedroom door at night. For the first time since the accident, he felt like he had done something that made his parents proud, wherever they were. On Saturday morning, Marcus sat in the reading nook of the Brooklyn Public Library, legs crossed under him, binder open across his lap, as Patricia Williams poured him another cup of apple juice in a paper cup. She was in her late 60s, soft-spoken but sharp-eyed, a retired paralegal who volunteered 3 days a week at the library's civic literacy program. It was she who had first noticed the boy lingering in the legal reference aisle, asking questions most adults couldn't answer, flipping through case law books like comic strips. "You did well," she said, sliding a new folder toward him. "But you know this isn't over." Marcus nodded. "I saw his face, Mr. Richardson. He wasn't shocked I caught him. He was shocked that I existed." Patricia chuckled. "You're not wrong." Then she grew quiet. "But you have something a lot of people fear: clarity. And when clarity lives inside a black child with a voice and proof, the system shakes." Marcus didn't say anything. He just sipped his juice and looked down at the new folder. It was a city compliance report on the housing program. At first glance, it looked like routine bureaucracy. But in the margins, Patricia had highlighted inconsistencies, payments that had quietly vanished before Dorothy ever touched the account. "Someone else helped Richardson," she said. "That kind of fraud doesn't happen without an inside man." "You think I should find out who?" Marcus asked. "I think you already are." That night, Marcus sat on the floor of his bedroom, cross-referencing documents while Dorothy folded laundry behind him. The hum of the heater filled the silence. He stopped suddenly, brow furrowing. "Grandma, what's the name of the building's accountant? The one who used to drop off the checks on Thursdays?" "Mr. Kellerman," she said, without hesitation. "Walter Kellerman. Retired 2 months ago. Moved to Florida. But his name's on this transfer request dated last week." Dorothy looked up, alarmed. "That's impossible." "That's forgery," Marcus whispered. "Or someone using his credentials." He pulled out his phone and sent a message to Patricia. The next morning, Patricia arrived at their home with a warm banana loaf and a determined glint in her eyes. "You're on to something," she said, setting her coat down. "I did a bit of digging last night. Walter Kellerman's credentials were used on multiple city systems last week, and all of them were accessed under a temporary IP address registered to the Department of Community Development." Marcus looked up. "That's city level." Patricia nodded grimly, which means Richardson wasn't working alone. And whoever helped him is still inside. Dorothy sat down slowly. "But why target me?" "Because you were clean," Marcus answered. "And small. You didn't have connections. You didn't have lawyers. They thought you'd fold." Patricia turned to Marcus. We're going to need more than courtroom flair this time. We need to bring this to the public eye. Carefully. Strategically. Marcus thought for a long moment. Then he picked up his binder and flipped to a clean sheet. Then we do what you taught me. We build a case. And we show them what the truth looks like when it's organized. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus and Patricia worked in secret. They combed through spreadsheets, scanned old emails, traced paper trails, and compared signatures. Marcus even used the public computers at the library to access FOIA databases. What they found was staggering. There had been at least 5 fake withdrawals attributed to other neighborhood organizations, all tied to the same routing number, different names, same fingerprints. Marcus started to map it all out with colored thread on a corkboard Dorothy gave him from her sewing closet. Blue for falsified payments, yellow for reused credentials, red for those who had gone silent. One name kept appearing: Susan Delacroix, an internal auditor for the Department of Community Development. She had signed off on at least 3 questionable reviews. Patricia raised an eyebrow when the pattern became clear. She used to work with Richardson years ago. He covered her tracks, Marcus said, and now she's covering his. On a rainy Thursday, Marcus and Patricia met with a journalist from the Brooklyn Sentinel, a tall man named Javier Morales, who had a reputation for exposing local corruption. At first, he was skeptical. "I'm not in the business of printing bedtime stories, kid." "Good," Marcus said, "because this isn't a story. It's evidence, and it's all here." He laid the binder flat on the table. 45 minutes later, Javier looked up, his face pale. "This is enough to start a fire that'll burn for weeks." Patricia smiled. "That's the idea." 3 days later, the Brooklyn Sentinel ran the story under the headline, "8-year-old legal prodigy exposes deeper web of city-level corruption." The public reaction was swift and visceral. City officials scrambled to launch internal reviews. Community leaders called for resignations. By the end of the week, Dorothy was reinstated on the advisory board of the housing program she once led. Richardson was indicted on conspiracy and evidence tampering. And Susan Delacroix quietly took medical leave, her office sealed for audit. But for Marcus, the moment that mattered most came on a quiet Sunday afternoon when he was back at the library, sitting with a group of kids his age who had heard what he did and wanted to know more. "Can we really understand the law?" one asked. "Even if we're just kids?" Marcus smiled and handed him a highlighter. "Only one way to find out." And so they did. One clause, one paragraph, one case at a time. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't loud, but it was real. The kind of real that changes futures. The kind of real that doesn't wait for permission. The kind of real his parents would have believed in. And as Dorothy watched him from across the library, a stack of fresh donations beside her, she realized something that made her eyes sting. Marcus hadn't just defended her. He had inherited her fight and turned it into something bigger. Something no system could silence. Not anymore. By the time spring began to bloom in Brooklyn, Marcus Johnson was no longer just a boy who had once spoken in court. He had become something else, something rarer, a symbol. Not the kind painted on posters or paraded in front of TV cameras, but the quiet kind, the kind people whispered about when they saw unfairness in their own neighborhoods, and suddenly remembered that once a child had proved that truth could rise in the face of power. The binder Marcus once carried had grown thicker, heavier with documents, evidence, letters of gratitude, and school papers tucked between pages of legal research. Patricia had gotten him a new one, leather-bound, stitched on the spine with his initials, but he still used the old duct-taped blue one. He said it reminded him why he started. Dorothy had begun sleeping better, cooking more, humming old jazz while folding laundry or reading court updates on her tablet. Her arthritis still flared, and her heart wasn't what it once was, but something in her spirit had come back. The weight of false accusation had lifted, and in its place grew something sturdy resolve. That month, the local community college invited Marcus to speak at a civic leadership workshop. The email had been addressed to Mr. Johnson, and the organizer had apologized profusely upon discovering he was 8. But Marcus didn't flinch. He stood behind the podium, feet barely reaching the stage carpet, binder open before him, and said, "Justice doesn't wait for you to grow up. It waits for you to speak up." The room fell silent. Then it erupted in applause. A week later, a senator's office called, then a documentary filmmaker, then a producer from a national news network. Dorothy deflected most of them. "He's still a child," she said. "Let him be one." But Marcus kept telling her, "It's not about me. It's about what people saw and what I did. Maybe it woke something up." It had. Donations to the housing program tripled. Several cities asked Dorothy to consult on reforming their oversight boards, and through it all, Marcus stayed grounded. He still played ball after school, still watched Saturday cartoons, still took his spelling tests seriously, even when the principal said she'd excuse him for being a little hero. He didn't want to be excused. He wanted to earn it. Then came the day the Brooklyn Law School called. They weren't offering him admission, not yet. They were inviting him to be a guest speaker at their annual conference on civic responsibility and procedural ethics. At 9 years old, Marcus Johnson became the youngest speaker in the institution's 121-year history. That morning, Dorothy pressed his good shirt with extra care and braided his hair neatly back. "You nervous?" she asked as he adjusted his sleeves. "A little," he admitted. "Not about what to say, about whether they'll listen." "Oh, baby," she said, touching his cheek. "They'll listen. You just remind them what listening sounds like." He stood before a hall of law students, professors, and legal scholars in suits that probably cost more than Dorothy's monthly income. But Marcus wasn't intimidated. He opened his binder, looked up, and began. "True justice doesn't happen when you defeat someone. It happens when you protect someone." He spoke not about law, but about love. About how every case file had a face, every number had a name, and that the law was never meant to be cold, it was supposed to hold. Hold people, hold truth, hold the powerful accountable to those with no microphones. There were no dry eyes by the time he finished. Even the dean stood to clap. Later that day, over lunch with the faculty, Marcus asked a question that stilled the table. "Why don't you teach this stuff earlier, in schools, in neighborhoods like mine?" The silence was sharp. Then one professor leaned forward and said, "Because no one ever asked us to." That night, Patricia met Marcus and Dorothy at the diner, sliding into the booth with a grin. "You did it again," she said. "I didn't do anything alone," Marcus replied. "But we can't stop now." "We won't," she promised. And so the next project was born, the Marcus Project, a legal literacy initiative for underserved kids in Brooklyn, started by a child and a retired librarian with a printer, a borrowed projector, and a belief that knowing your rights was the first step to changing your story. They started with one school, then 5, then 25. Marcus would visit classrooms, binder in hand, and tell students not just how to read a key tract, but how to write their own future. The law's just a tool, he'd say. It can protect, or it can punish. Depends on who holds it. I want you to hold it. Kids listened. Teachers cried. Some parents sent letters saying it was the first time their child believed their voice mattered. One boy in East Flatbush told Marcus, "I thought you had to be old to be powerful, but now I think you just have to be brave." Back at home, things changed too. The mayor's office issued a public apology to Dorothy. Her charges were expunged from the record. She was awarded a citation for civic service. But the proudest day came quietly, with no cameras, when she was invited back to sit on the board of the same housing program that had once turned its back on her. The new director, a young woman named Kiana, who had grown up in the projects Dorothy once managed, said, "We want your wisdom. We want your standard." Dorothy took a deep breath, then smiled. "Only if I get to bring my grandson to meetings. We were hoping you would." And so Marcus became the youngest advisor in the program's history. Not officially, but in every room, every vote, every decision that required truth. He didn't speak often, but when he did, people listened. One evening, months after the trial, Marcus sat with Dorothy on the rooftop of their building, eating peach cobbler from paper plates as the city lights flickered below. "You ever wonder what life would be like if none of that happened?" he asked. Dorothy thought a moment. "You mean if they never accused me?" "Yeah, if I never had to stand up like that." She looked at him gently. "Then maybe you would have kept drawing spaceships. Maybe I'd still be quietly making soup for neighbors and worrying about rent." She paused. "But then again, maybe none of those neighbors would have gotten new housing. Maybe no one would have known what was broken. And maybe you wouldn't have found out how strong your voice is." Marcus didn't answer right away. He just leaned his head against her shoulder and whispered, "I don't regret it. Even the hard parts. I think this is what I'm supposed to do." Dorothy nodded. "Then I'll be right here, baby. Every step. You just keep walking. The world will catch up." Down in the city, the lights burned steady. And in a second-floor apartment in a quiet Brooklyn block, the future of justice was already wide awake, drafting the next outline. And the binder, still full, still open. The morning of the legislative hearing in Albany was colder than expected. A late frost had swept through upstate New York, turning the lawns around the state capitol brittle with white. Inside the hearing chamber, microphones buzzed faintly, papers shuffled, and a sense of bureaucratic routine hummed through the polished wood and navy suits. But something was different this morning. It wasn't on the agenda. It wasn't part of any party strategy. It came walking in at exactly 8:59 a.m., wearing polished shoes, a pressed navy jacket, and carrying a blue binder with duct tape still hugging the corners. Marcus Johnson, 9 years old, stood behind the witness table as the chairwoman adjusted her glasses and asked with a faint smile, "Young man, are you sure you want to give testimony?" Marcus nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I want to speak for the kids who can't." The room fell quiet. What followed wasn't a speech. It was a blueprint. A proposal for a bill named the Marcus Law. A new safeguard requiring prosecutors to present documented proof of a defendant's physical presence at the time of a financial crime, not just circumstantial oversight. It was the very hole that nearly swallowed Dorothy's life. Marcus read every word calmly, clearly, pausing only to sip water and flip to highlighted pages. Lawmakers leaned in. Journalists scribbled. One representative from the Bronx whispered to another, "This kid just did more in 20 minutes than some lobbyists do in a year." When Marcus finished, he looked up and said, "Justice isn't just about punishing bad people. It's about protecting good ones. My grandma taught me that. The system should too." The chairwoman thanked him, her voice soft with emotion, and the vote was unanimous. The Marcus Law passed through committee by noon and was sent to the full chamber with rare bipartisan support. Outside the Capitol steps, cameras waited. Reporters surged. But Marcus didn't stop to talk. He found Dorothy standing beneath the Statue of Justice, bundled in her coat, cheeks pink from the wind. She didn't say a word. She just opened her arms. And Marcus ran into them like a child who had never stood behind a podium, never stared down prosecutors, never changed a state's legal process, just a grandson who needed to be held. That night, back in Brooklyn, the community center held a celebration. Not a big gala or televised event, just folding chairs, baked macaroni, and local musicians playing Sam Cooke songs in the corner. Everyone came. Neighbors, caseworkers, teachers, city clerks. Even a retired judge showed up and quietly shook Marcus's hand. There were speeches, of course, but the one that mattered most came when Dorothy took the mic, her voice still raspy but strong. "They tried to make us small," she said, scanning the crowd, "but my grandson reminded them who we are. And he reminded me who I still am, a fighter, a servant, and a grandmother who will never stop showing up." The applause was long and loud. Marcus sat in the front row, blinking back tears. Patricia placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, "You've rewritten more than a law, sweetheart. You've rewritten hope." The Marcus Project, now funded by 3 foundations, had expanded to other boroughs. Legal literacy classes popped up in laundromats, churches, barbershops. Dorothy taught one on tenants' rights every Thursday at the community library. Marcus started mentoring younger kids, teaching them how to question respectfully, how to demand truth, how to defend with dignity. One Saturday morning, a boy no older than 7 stood beside Marcus and asked, "Can anyone change things, even if they're small?" Marcus knelt down and answered, "Especially if they're small." Months passed. The seasons turned. The city moved on in ways cities always do, but Marcus didn't fade into memory. He became part of its rhythm. His story entered classrooms, not as folklore, but as curriculum. His binder, now displayed at the Brooklyn Public Library, sat beneath glass beside the words, "Let truth be the loudest thing we carry." Dorothy, now a state advisor on housing equity, gave interviews only when it mattered. She still made peach cobbler every Sunday, still walked with a limp on rainy days, but she moved with the peace of a woman whose name had been returned and whose legacy had found legs. One crisp October evening, as the sun sank low over the rooftops, Marcus sat on the porch of their small brick apartment, legs swinging, hands tucked into his hoodie. Dorothy sat beside him, sipping tea from her favorite chipped mug. They watched as the leaves turned gold and orange, swirling like slow dancers on the sidewalk. "Grandma," Marcus said, his voice quiet, "do you think people will remember this in 10 years? Dorothy smiled. "Maybe, maybe not, but I don't care if they remember the name. I care if they remember the lesson." "Which lesson?" he asked. "That sometimes," she said, reaching for his hand, "the strongest voice in the room comes from the smallest chair." He smiled, leaned his head on her shoulder and closed his eyes. Below them, on the street, a little girl skipped past the stoop carrying a backpack far too large for her frame. As she passed, she looked up at the porch and said, "Hi, Marcus," before running off into the dusk. He raised a hand in quiet reply, then turned back to the fading skyline. Somewhere out there, more stories were waiting, more fights to fight, more truths to carry. But for now, for just a little while, Brooklyn breathed easy, because one boy with a binder had reminded it how to listen again, and the city would never forget the sound.